myth number two is that they say, okay, the stock market crash in 1929. Most history textbooks will say, oh, it's because of there was lax regulation, and then the next myth they'll go into is to say, and then the reason that crash turned into a decade-long depression was because Herbert Hoover just sat back and did nothing. Right? That's why the stock market crash of 29 festered into what we now call the Great Depression. So that's what you would typically get in an American history book. But the reality is that Hoover actually was the most interventionist president in U.S. history to that point, at least in terms of during peacetime. And also, before we even consider what he did and how interventionist he was, if you just think about it, on the face of it, that story doesn't really make much sense. To say the reason we had the Great Depression was that Herbert Hoover was too timid, or he was too unwilling to be an activist president, because all of his predecessors were at least as timid as he was, right? It's not that earlier U.S. presidents had established Social Security and FDIC and all these things that we associate with the New Deal, and then Herbert Hoover came along and dismantled them, right? So it doesn't really explain why the Great Depression happened when it did if you're going to blame it on the inaction of Herbert Hoover, because all his earlier predecessors, they had presided over what were called financial panics or even depressions, but with a small d. So the 29 crash wasn't the first stock market crash in U.S. history, and the unemployment of the early 1930s, that wasn't the first time there had been widespread unemployment in U.S. history. No, there had been lots of panics or depressions with a small d in U.S. history before then. So to say, oh, the thing that was different this time, the reason this one turned into the big one, the Great Depression, is because Herbert Hoover didn't do anything, that doesn't really explain anything, right? Because none of his predecessors did anything either, in the sense of doing something. So, but what would make sense is if Herbert Hoover did something different, and that's what I argue in the book, is that, no, Herbert Hoover actually did things different from what his predecessors did, and so that makes sense that under his guidance or administration, on his watch, things turned out differently, that we had the worst depression because he changed the rule book. Right? And we'll talk in a little bit about what specifically he did. So just to compare Herbert Hoover with FDR, who in some textbooks at least are contrasted as if they're polar opposites, no, they did generally the same types of things. They both propped up wages and farm prices. They both hiked taxes, they both engaged in deficit spending, and they both spent money on what we would now call public works. Right? So it's true, FDR under the New Deal did those things more, but he just exaggerated or took to the next level all the things that Herbert Hoover set in motion. And in fact, it was by the late 1930s, there was a high-ranking member of the New Deal apparatus that said, this is an exact quote, but he said something to the effect that, well, yeah, we never would have admitted it at the time, but all the stuff we did under the New Deal, actually Herbert Hoover started, and we just elaborated upon it. Okay, the one, just to clarify, the one significant difference between the two in terms of economic policy is that Herbert Hoover didn't think the U.S. should abandon the gold standard, whereas FDR, that was one of the first things he did. Okay, so that was one significant ideological difference between them, but other than that, it's not that Herbert Hoover was this diehard constitutionalist, laissez-faire guy. No, he believed that the federal government had a large role in ameliorating a downturn, and that the president should do what he could to help people suffering and so forth. Okay, just to give you a little bit of data here. So you can see the top chart is federal spending by fiscal year. So you can see that goes up through 1932. And so this, again, the idea you would get reading the history books or reading current people, a lot of people now, I've seen this over and over, refer to the modern Tea Party movement as Herbert Hoover economics. And they say, oh, the modern Tea Party wants to slash spending like Herbert Hoover did. And that's completely misleading. You can see spending went up. It's true, in the next fiscal year, I don't have it on this graph, in the next one, spending went down by like a few $100 million or something out of a $4.5 billion budget. That's true, but I mean, spending was still much higher when Herbert Hoover left office than when he started. Okay, so in general, Hoover increased spending, and he certainly was increasing federal spending as unemployment kept going up and up and up. All right, and then you can see also the deficit as a share of GDP grows to about 4% of the economy by this fiscal year 1932. Okay, so again, if you want to argue, people who subscribe to what's called Keynesian economics and think the government needs to run big deficits to fill a shortfall in what's called aggregate demand, if you want to say Herbert Hoover didn't do enough, okay, that's fine, you could argue that, but it's just not true when people say that Herbert Hoover was this big budget slasher who was committed to balanced budgets. That wasn't true. In his mind, what happened is he was running big deficits, and he was. These were unprecedented peacetime deficits. Okay, I mean, the government ran bigger deficits during World War I, but for peacetime, just to try to get the economy out of a slump, this was unprecedented. And it was just, he kept trying it for year after year, and it wasn't working, so then finally he blinked and thought, okay, we got to back off a little bit. But it clearly was not working. The economy kept getting worse and worse, and was already far worse than it had ever been in U.S. history to that point. So he tried the big spending medicine, and it wasn't working. It was making the patient sicker. Just to give you another example, I don't have the quote here on a slide, but I'll just paraphrase off the top of my head. In the 1932 presidential campaign, so FDR is running against the incumbent Herbert Hoover, and FDR campaigned on a platform of a balanced budget and excoriated the big spending Hoover. And he said, again, not an exact quote, but words to the effect that, never, my study of American history, never have I seen such reckless borrowing as has happened under the current administration. Okay, so that's FDR complaining that Herbert Hoover is this big spender, and he's borrowing money and running up the public debt. Okay, so of course politicians always exaggerate and try to vilify their opponents, but the point is, if Herbert Hoover actually had been tight-fisted and refused to spend a penny as the economy plunged into the Great Depression, you would think FDR would be excoriating him for not spending enough, but that's not what FDR did, because that would have been absurd, because Hoover was spending more than anybody had in his shoes previously. Okay, just another example. Here's a famous public work. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but that's the Hoover Dam. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to get people to see Herbert Hoover was not this tight-fisted guy who refused to spend money during the Depression. Give you another illustration, and I'll just go for a few more minutes and I'll turn over your guys' questions. I'm saying here labor unions love Herbert Hoover. So one of the main things he did, if you ask me, what was the single biggest reason that unemployment got to be so high under the Hoover administration, there were two things going on. One is that the way the banking system worked back then, we can't get into it too deeply right now, but people were scared, banks were failing, and so a lot of people were pulling their money out of banks, particularly if they heard rumors that their bank was vulnerable and had made bad investments during the mania in the 20s. And so our banking system is on a fractional reserve basis, meaning, as I'm sure you all know, when you give $100 to the bank, they don't just go put it in a drawer with your name on it. They lend out a lot of that money. So that's why a bank is vulnerable to a bank run. If everybody shows up on the same day and wants to take their money out, the bank doesn't have it because they've lent most of it out. Okay, so that's why the banks are vulnerable. And so that was happening, that once confidence in a bank would fall, the bank was dead. So the twist, though, is when the banks, if you just think about it, so if you put $100 in the bank and they give you a receipt, so you're walking around looking at your checking account balance thinking you have $100 in there. If the bank then takes $20 of that and lends it to somebody else, well, now that person thinks he has $20 too, even though it's the same money that's now, in a sense, in both of our possession. Okay, so in a very legitimate sense, the way economists quantify this stuff or measure it, they would say the money supply just went up by $20 when the banker lent that $20 to the other person that was your deposit. Okay, because you still think you have the full 100. You don't think you now have 80. You think you've got 100, and you're writing checks on that. And that person thinks he has 20 that he didn't have the day before. Okay, so by this fractional reserve system, the money supply expands. It's inflation in that sense. So when that unravels, if people get scared and they go to the bank and they pull their money out, then the bank has to sort of, unwind all these loans and everything. So the point is the total money supply was crashing. So that was going on from 29 to 1933. So you had the actual, in a sense, amount of dollar bills in the economy, not the green pieces of paper, but in terms of on the bank balance sheets and people in their checking account balances, that was actually shrinking. It went down by about a third over those few years. So prices in general were really collapsing pretty hard. And then in that environment, with prices in general falling, Herbert Hoover, after the stock market crash, tells all the business leaders, he calls a conference and brings in all the big business leaders to Washington, and he tells them, I don't want you guys to cut your wages. All right, keep paying your employees the same hourly wage you paid them before the stock market crash, because Hoover was thinking that would just make things worse. Because he was subscribing to the idea that it takes spending to keep the economy going. And so if Hoover thought if these businesses panic because of the stock market crash and they cut their wages that they pay to their workers, well, now the workers don't have enough money to go spend, and then that causes business to flounder even more, and it just causes this downward spiral. So Hoover thought he was going to nip that in the bud right away. And you can see that labor unions were praising him. So again, we have this idea of the Hoovervilles and stuff like that, and everybody hated Herbert Hoover because he was a miser sitting in the White House and didn't care. But no, they liked what he was doing before it was obvious how bad his policies would be. So they say here, these are the labor unions. This is an editorial from the American Federationist, which was a labor union publication that came out in January of 1930. And they say the President's Conference, where he got all the business leaders together, has given industrial leaders a new sense of their responsibilities. Never before have they been called upon to act together. Okay, so again, this isn't just some right-wing conspiracy theory or something, that I'm showing. Labor unions at the time were praising Hoover for his far-sightedness, for his compassion, for being progressive, that Hoover was doing things differently from what would have happened under his predecessors. People thought, finally, we have a president who's going to roll up his sleeves and use the power of the federal government to fight this thing. So now, to see why is this so bad? Well, think about it. Prices in general are falling very quickly, and the president, using the bully pulpit and also some other, incentives that the government could do, convinces big businesses not to cut the wages that they pay their employees. So what that meant is year after year, if the price of the products kept falling, but businesses aren't allowed to cut their wages, that means their employees keep getting more and more expensive. All right, and in fact, in the book, I go through some statistics showing that wage rates in terms of relative to other prices rose more quickly during the first few years of the Depression than they did during the Roaring '20s. Okay, so that's the opposite of what you want to have happen. If business is plummeting, you want workers to become cheaper. You don't want it to become more expensive to hire a worker while your business is falling apart, because you're not going to hire more. So what would happen is people would lose their jobs, certain businesses would fold, and then those unemployed workers, they couldn't get work elsewhere because labor just kept getting more and more expensive. All right, so that's, there's lots of stuff going on, obviously, but in terms of what was the one body blow to the U.S. economy and why did things happen differently this time around, that's the thing I would point to. That as prices were falling, the wages were not allowed to fall because of the president's theory that he had, that he was helping. And so workers kept getting more and more expensive as the Depression ground on, and that's why unemployment went up so much. That, if you make something expensive, people buy less of it. So if you make labor more and more expensive, employers will hire fewer and fewer workers. And that's what we're trying to explain. Why were employers not willing to hire more? Well, because the president's policies made them very expensive.